May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but in a small Czech town, American and Soviet soldiers aimed weapons at each other. In the middle stood Patton, refusing to back down. For nearly an hour, the world balanced on the edge of another war. This is the story of how close we came to World War III before World War II even officially ended. The newspapers had announced victory. Hitler was dead in his bunker. Germany had signed unconditional surrender. Millions of soldiers were supposed to pack up and go home to their families. But on this dusty road near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, nobody was celebrating. Nobody was shaking hands or sharing cigarettes like the propaganda photographs showed. Instead, American soldiers from Patton's Third Army crouched behind vehicles with rifles raised. Across from them, Soviet troops did the same. Tank turrets slowly traversed, acquiring targets. Radio operators screamed into handsets, begging for instructions from headquarters that seemed impossibly far away. And in the middle of this chaos, one man stood completely still. General George S. Patton watched the Soviet line with cold, calculating eyes. His hand rested casually near his famous ivory-handled revolver. He had faced German panzers, Italian artillery, and North African sandstorms. He wasn't about to flinch now. The confrontation had been building for weeks. Everyone at Supreme Headquarters knew it. The alliance between America and the Soviet Union had always been a marriage of convenience, two incompatible systems united only by their shared hatred of Nazi Germany. Now that Germany was defeated, the incompatibilities were impossible to ignore. Patton had seen it coming before anyone else. While other generals celebrated victories and planned homecoming parades, Patton studied maps and intelligence reports with growing alarm. The Soviets weren't just liberating Eastern Europe, they were conquering it. Every country the Red Army entered became a Soviet puppet state within months. Free elections were promised and never held. Opposition leaders disappeared in the night. Secret police established networks of informants. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, one by one they vanished behind what would later be called the Iron Curtain. And now Czechoslovakia was next. Patton's Third Army sat just miles from Prague, easily capable of liberating the ancient capital, but orders from above said stop. Hold position. Let the Soviets have it. Those orders had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and Patton still couldn't accept them. He had read them dozens of times, hoping to find some loophole, some ambiguity he could exploit. There was none. The language was clear and direct. Third Army would advance no further than Pilsen. Prague and all territory east of the demarcation line belonged to the Soviet sphere. These boundaries had been negotiated at the highest levels, agreed upon by Roosevelt and Stalin at Yalta, confirmed by Truman after Roosevelt's death. Patton had no authority to challenge them, but that didn't stop him from trying. He sent message after message to Eisenhower arguing his case. The Czech resistance was begging for American help. German forces in the area were collapsing. Third Army could reach Prague in 72 hours with minimal casualties. The Soviet forces were still fighting through heavy resistance further east. Every military logic supported advancing. Every strategic consideration demanded it. But military logic and strategic considerations didn't matter anymore. Politics had taken over. The war was ending, and politicians were dividing the spoils. Eisenhower's responses grew increasingly terse. The decision was made. The agreements would be honored. Further argument was pointless and potentially insubordinate. Patton should focus on his assigned duties and stop creating diplomatic complications. But Patton couldn't stop. It wasn't in his nature. He began speaking publicly about his concerns, giving interviews to journalists, making comments at dinner parties that found their way into newspapers. The Soviets, he said, were no better than the Nazis. They had simply replaced one form of tyranny with another. America had fought the wrong enemy, or rather had stopped fighting too soon. The real threat to freedom wasn't the defeated Wehrmacht rotting in prisoner camps. It was the Red Army spreading across Europe like a bloodstain. These statements caused immediate problems. Soviet diplomats filed formal complaints. American officials scrambled to distance themselves from Patton's remarks. Eisenhower called personally to demand that Patton keep his opinions private. The request was ignored. Patton had never learned to keep quiet about anything. The first direct encounters between American and Soviet forces had occurred along the Elbe River in late April. These meetings were carefully staged for maximum propaganda value. Soldiers from both armies shook hands, exchanged souvenirs, posed for photographs that would appear in newspapers around the world. The message was clear and reassuring. The Great Alliance had held. Former enemies were now friends. The future would be peaceful. Patton attended one of these ceremonies and watched the festivities with barely concealed contempt. He saw what the cameras didn't capture: Soviet political officers monitoring every interaction, taking notes on which Russian soldiers seemed too friendly with Americans. The nervous glances exchanged between Red Army troops when they thought no one was watching. The way conversations died whenever certain topics arose. These weren't free men celebrating victory. These were prisoners putting on a show for their captors. Patton's intelligence officers confirmed his suspicions. Soviet soldiers had been explicitly warned against fraternizing with Western allies. Those who became too close would face interrogation. Some had already disappeared. Despite his misgivings, Patton was ordered to attend several formal meetings with Soviet commanders during early May. Protocol demanded courtesy. Alliances required maintenance. Whatever Patton personally thought about communism, he was expected to shake hands, exchange toasts, and smile for photographs. He complied with visible reluctance. At one such meeting, he encountered Marshal Ivan Konev, the Soviet commander whose forces would soon occupy Prague. Konev was a genuine war hero, a survivor of the brutal Eastern Front campaigns that had broken the German army. He had commanded troops at Kursk, overseen the bloody advance through Poland, fought his way into Germany itself. By any measure, he was Patton's equal in military accomplishment. The two generals regarded each other with wary respect. They exchanged pleasantries through interpreters, toasted victory with vodka, discussed the final operations of the war. On the surface, everything was cordial, but beneath the diplomatic pleasantries, both men understood something their governments refused to acknowledge. The alliance was already dead. After the photographers left, the conversation shifted. Patton began asking questions about Soviet intentions that made his aides nervous. What would happen to Czechoslovakia after occupation? Would free elections be permitted? What about the Baltic states, Poland, the other countries now under Soviet control? Konev deflected with practiced ease. These were political matters beyond his authority. He was a soldier, not a diplomat. Such questions should be directed to appropriate government channels. Patton pressed harder. He knew evasion when he heard it. He had spent a lifetime reading men, understanding what they meant beneath what they said. Konev was hiding something, or rather hiding everything. The Soviet marshal's eyes remained flat and unreadable even as his words grew more carefully chosen. At some point, Patton made a comment that crossed an invisible line. The interpreter hesitated before translating, then spoke reluctantly. Konev's expression hardened. His response came clipped and cold. The meeting ended shortly afterward with perfunctory handshakes and forced smiles that fooled nobody. Meanwhile, the situation in Czechoslovakia grew increasingly desperate. Czech resistance fighters had been battling German occupation for 6 years. They had suffered enormously, losing thousands of fighters to Nazi reprisals. Now, with liberation finally at hand, they faced a terrible choice. American forces sat tantalizingly close, representing everything they had fought for: democracy, freedom, self-determination. But those forces weren't coming. Instead, the Soviets approached from the east, bringing a different kind of liberation entirely. Resistance leaders sent messenger after messenger to American lines, pleading for help. They knew what Soviet occupation meant. They had contacts in Poland who had described the new reality there: the arrests, the disappearances, the sham elections, the suffocating control over every aspect of life. They didn't want that future for their country. They begged Patton to advance, to liberate Prague before the Red Army arrived. Patton received these messengers personally, listening to their stories with genuine sympathy and growing frustration. His hands were tied. Orders were orders, but he couldn't bring himself to send them away with nothing. Patton provided what help he could without technically violating his instructions. Weapons and ammunition flowed to resistance groups through unofficial channels. Medical supplies, communication equipment, and intelligence about German positions were shared freely. His staff officers worried these activities would cause problems if discovered. Patton dismissed their concerns. What were they going to do? Fire him? He had been threatened with relief so many times, it had become meaningless. Besides, helping people fight for their freedom seemed considerably more important than obeying arbitrary lines drawn by politicians who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The Czech fighters received these supplies gratefully, understanding they represented more than material support. They represented acknowledgement. An American general, perhaps the most famous American general, believed their cause was just. Even if he couldn't save them from Soviet occupation, he could ensure they had the means to resist. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. But it was something. The incident that nearly started World War III happened without warning on a morning that seemed no different from any other. A Soviet armored column, consisting of several tanks and supporting vehicles, crossed into territory that American forces were assigned to control. Whether this was intentional provocation, navigational error, or simple confusion in the chaotic post-surrender environment was never determined. The column advanced several miles into the American zone before encountering a Third Army checkpoint. The American soldiers manning that checkpoint faced an impossible situation. Soviet vehicles weren't supposed to be there, but the war was over technically, and these were supposed to be allies. What was the correct response? Nobody had provided guidance for this scenario. The young lieutenant in charge made a decision that would have enormous consequences. He ordered his men to block the road and refused to let the Soviet column pass until he received clarification from higher command. The Soviet commander, equally uncertain, ordered his vehicles to halt and demanded the Americans move aside. Within an hour, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. The American lieutenant had radioed for support and received it. Additional Third Army units arrived and took up defensive positions around the checkpoint. The Soviet commander had done the same, calling for reinforcements that rumbled up from the east. Now nearly 200 soldiers faced each other across 100 yards of dusty road. Weapons were loaded and aimed. Tank engines idled ready to move on command. Nervous fingers rested on triggers. Radio operators frantically tried to reach headquarters, but communication lines were overwhelmed with confused traffic. Nobody seemed to know who had authority to resolve this. Meanwhile, soldiers on both sides stared at men they had been told were allies, men they had been prepared to die alongside just weeks earlier, and saw enemies instead. The tension was physical, oppressive, like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone understood that one wrong move, one panicked shot, one misunderstood order could unleash catastrophe. Then a jeep appeared from the American rear, moving fast, trailing dust. It stopped directly in the empty space between the two forces, that deadly no-man's land where bullets would cross in seconds if fighting started. General George S. Patton stepped out, straightened his uniform, and began walking toward the Soviet line. He walked slowly, deliberately, hands visible at his sides. Every weapon on both sides tracked his progress. Soviet soldiers who had heard stories about this American general watched in disbelief as he approached alone. Patton stopped in the middle of the road, roughly equidistant from both forces, and stood there, waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the Soviet line. A colonel, judging by his insignia. He walked toward Patton with the same deliberate pace, the same visible hands. They met in the middle of the road, two officers surrounded by enough firepower to start another world war, and began to talk. The Soviet colonel's name was Dmitry Volkov. He had survived some of the most horrific battles in human history. Stalingrad, where he had fought house to house through frozen rubble for months. Kursk, the largest tank battle ever waged, where he had watched hundreds of vehicles burn around him. The bloody advance through Poland and into Germany itself, where every mile cost lives. Volkov had seen more death than most men could imagine. He was not easily intimidated by anything, but watching this American general walk toward him through a field of aimed weapons, moving with absolute confidence as if the danger simply didn't exist, Volkov felt something unexpected. Respect. He had been briefed about Patton, the aggressive commander who wanted to continue fighting, the general who called Russians enemies in public speeches, the man whose Third Army had crossed Germany faster than anyone thought possible. Volkov had expected arrogance, hostility, perhaps even madness. Instead, he saw a fellow professional, a soldier who understood war as deeply as Volkov himself understood it. The two men spoke through improvised translation, a Soviet sergeant who knew some English and an American private who had studied Russian in college. Communication was imperfect, halting, full of pauses while phrases were puzzled out. But somehow they made themselves understood. Patton proposed they step away from their respective forces and discuss the situation privately. Volkov agreed. They walked together to the shade of a half-ruined building, leaving two armies staring at each other in confused silence. What happened during that private conversation would never be officially recorded. Both men were accompanied only by their translators, who were later ordered never to discuss the details. But fragments emerged over the years through memoirs, interviews, and declassified documents. Patton reportedly spoke with characteristic bluntness about his views on the Soviet Union. He didn't pretend friendship or hide his concerns about communist expansion, but he also expressed genuine admiration for the Soviet soldiers' courage and sacrifice against Germany. Volkov responded with equal honesty. He acknowledged that his government viewed America with suspicion and that another war might eventually come, but he personally had no desire to fight Americans. His country had lost over 20 million people in this war. His own brother had died at Stalingrad. His village had been burned by German troops, killing everyone he had grown up with. Volkov was tired of death. He wanted peace more than anything else. Not the temporary peace of exhausted armies catching their breath, but real peace that would let him go home and try to rebuild something from the ashes. Patton listened carefully. He recognized truth when he heard it. This Soviet colonel wasn't a political commissar spouting ideology. He was a soldier who had paid enormous personal costs for victory. They might be enemies eventually. The systems they served might be fundamentally incompatible. But in this moment, on this dusty road, they were simply two men who had seen too much killing to want more. That common ground was enough. After nearly an hour of conversation, they reached an agreement. The Soviet column had made a navigational error. It would withdraw immediately to the correct zone. The Americans would remain in their positions. Both sides would report to their superiors that a minor confusion had been resolved through professional military cooperation. No shots fired, no international incident, no World War III. They shook hands, a gesture witnessed by hundreds of watching soldiers who had no idea what had just transpired. Then both men returned to their respective forces and began issuing orders. Soviet tanks reversed and rumbled back the way they had come. American soldiers lowered their weapons and allowed themselves to breathe again. Within an hour, The road was empty except for dust settling slowly in the afternoon light. The crisis that could have changed history simply dissolved, leaving no trace except memories that would fade with time. News of the standoff never reached newspapers. Both American and Soviet commanders had strong reasons to keep it quiet. Acknowledging how close they had come to disaster would raise uncomfortable questions that nobody wanted to answer. Why were Soviet forces in American-controlled territory? Why were American soldiers prepared to fire on allies? Who was responsible for the confusion that nearly triggered catastrophe? Better to pretend it never happened. But word spread through military channels despite official silence. Patton's superiors demanded explanations that he provided with characteristic directness. A Soviet column entered his zone. His men blocked them. He personally negotiated their withdrawal. Problem solved. What was the issue? The issue, Eisenhower explained with strained patience, was that Patton had once again taken matters into his own hands without authorization. The issue was that he had conducted personal diplomacy with Soviet commanders without clearing it through proper channels. The issue was that he seemed incapable of following basic protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous situation. Patton's relationship with his superiors continued deteriorating through the summer. He kept making public statements about Soviet intentions that embarrassed the government. He kept arguing for more aggressive policies that nobody wanted to implement. He kept treating every instruction as a suggestion to be evaluated rather than an order to be followed. By autumn, his position had become untenable. He was transferred from 3rd Army Command to the 15th Army, a unit responsible for compiling military history. It was a prestigious title attached to a meaningless job. Everyone understood the message. Patton accepted the transfer with defiant grace, announcing that if they wanted him to study history, he would make sure it was honest history. He began gathering documents, conducting interviews, assembling evidence of decisions he believed were mistakes, the missed opportunities in Czechoslovakia, the territory surrendered to Soviet control without military necessity. The alliance that had fractured before the victory celebrations ended. Future generations would have the truth, even if present leaders preferred comfortable lies. Patton's warnings proved accurate faster than even he expected. Within months of Germany's surrender, the wartime alliance had completely collapsed. Soviet forces refused to withdraw from occupied territories. Communist governments were installed through rigged elections and intimidation. Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, finally acknowledging publicly what Patton had been saying privately for most of a year. The Cold War had begun, exactly as Patton predicted. It would last 45 years, consume trillions of dollars, cost countless lives in proxy conflicts around the world, and bring humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation multiple times. Eastern Europe would remain imprisoned behind that Iron Curtain until 1989, when the system finally collapsed under its own contradictions. Czechoslovakia, the country Patton had wanted to liberate, would endure 4 decades of communist rule before achieving freedom. Prague, the city his tanks could have reached in 3 days, would wait that long for genuine liberation. Every prediction Patton made came true. None of it mattered because nobody had listened when action was still possible. The soldiers who witnessed that confrontation near Pilsen carried the memory forever. American veterans told their families about the day they almost started another war. Soviet veterans, more cautiously, shared fragments with trusted friends. Some wrote memoirs that gathered dust in archives. Others gave interviews decades later, when the Cold War had finally ended, and such stories seemed safely historical. Their accounts differ on details, but agree on essential facts. It was close. Closer than anyone wanted to admit. One nervous finger, one misunderstood command, one moment of panic could have changed everything. That disaster was avoided owed much to luck and, more, to 2 men who chose talking over shooting. Patton died 6 months later in a car accident, never seeing the Cold War he predicted play out. Volkov survived until the 1970s, rising to general before retiring quietly. They never met again. But for 1 hour on a dusty Czechoslovakian road, a legendary American warrior and an exhausted Soviet colonel found enough common ground to step back from the abyss. Sometimes that's how history works, not through grand strategies or brilliant tactics, but through two tired men deciding they had seen enough death for one lifetime. Patton spent his entire life preparing for war. He studied ancient battles, memorized tactics, trained relentlessly for combat. But his most important moment might have been when he chose not to fight, when he walked alone toward those Soviet tanks and started talking instead of shooting. What do you think would have happened if someone else had been commanding that day? Someone less bold, or maybe more reckless? Would the Cold War have turned hot right there in Czechoslovakia? Tell me in the comments what you think. And if this story changed how you see Patton, I want to hear that too. History remembers him as a warrior who always attacked, but maybe the greatest warriors know when not to fight.